They harassed and mocked her for being a black woman, until she took them all down. 2 men cornered her deep in the Georgia woods. "Just be nice, and no one gets hurt," one hissed. She didn't scream. She didn't run. 5 seconds later, one was flat on his back, the other clutching his knee in agony. Then came the twist. She flashed her badge. "Lieutenant Colonel Yanel Brooks, U.S. Army, you picked the wrong woman." Yanel Brooks stepped out of her battered SUV, her boots hitting the gravel with a soft crunch. The morning air carried the faint calls of ducks, a promise of the hunt ahead in Georgia's National Hunting Reserve. At 30, Yanel moved with a quiet, coiled strength, her khaki jacket fitting snugly over her athletic frame, her dark eyes scanning the scene with sharp focus. Valer, her German short-haired pointer, leaped from the backseat, his black and white coat gleaming, his tail a blur of anticipation. She gave him a quick pat, her fingers lingering on his collar. "Stay sharp, boy," she said, her voice low but steady. Valer's ears perked, his gaze locked on hers, his training evident in his taut readiness. The reserve buzzed with the energy of the annual duck hunting competition. Hunters hauled gear from trucks, their voices loud with boasts and laughter, dogs barking in the distance. Yanel slung her rifle over her shoulder, checking the safety with a fluid motion that spoke of years of practice. She'd grown up hunting in these marshes, taught by her mother, a woman who'd faced her own battles in a world quick to judge. Today, Yanel was here for the hunt, and something more personal. She felt the weight of eyes on her, some curious, others skeptical, as she moved toward the check-in station. A black woman in this space always drew stares. She straightened her shoulders, her beauty sharp and commanding, and kept walking. At the check-in table, she signed her name with quick, precise strokes. The clerk, a wiry man with a clipboard, glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Brooks?" he asked, his tone neutral, but his eyes lingering, as if questioning her presence. Yanel nodded, handing over her registration slip. "That's me." He scribbled something, then waved her on without a word. She felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but brushed it aside, her focus on the hunt. Valer trotted beside her, his nose twitching, ready to work. As she headed toward the staging area, she caught the sound of voices behind her, low and mocking. "Check it out, Mike," one said, his tone dripping with amusement. "A girl out here. That's new." Yanel's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes forward, adjusting her rifle strap. She recognized the voices, 2 hunters, both around 35, in camouflage vests, their trucks parked nearby with decals of shotguns and deer antlers. Mike, the taller one with a scruffy beard, chuckled. "Yeah, Greg, and she's got some style. Too bad she's, you know." His voice dropped, but the implication landed like a stone in Yanel's gut. She'd heard it before, too many times, in locker rooms, on training grounds, in places where her skill was overshadowed by her skin. She kept walking, Valer at her side, but the men's boots crunched closer, their voices growing bolder. "Hey, sweetheart," Greg called, his tone a mix of mockery and fake charm. "You lost. This ain't no tea party." Yanel stopped, turning to face them. Her eyes were steady, unflinching, her presence a quiet challenge. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said, her voice calm, but edged with steel. Valer shifted, his body tensing, sensing the shift in her mood. Mike grinned, stepping closer, his rifle slung carelessly. "You hunting? That gun even work, darling?" His eyes raked over her, lingering on her curves, his smirk twisting into something uglier. Yanel's fingers brushed her phone in her pocket, discreetly pressing record. She'd heard whispers about this reserve, women harassed, belittled, their complaints ignored. She'd come prepared, not just for ducks but for justice. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You don't just fight for yourself, Yanel. You fight for those who come after. She checked her rifle again, her movements deliberate, ignoring their taunts. It works fine, she said. Better than yours, I'd wager. Greg laughed, a sharp, grating sound that drew a few glances from nearby hunters. Oh, she's got attitude, he said, closing the distance. Look at her, Mike. Thinks she's one of us. Yonel's heart beat steady, her training keeping her calm. She'd faced worse, hostile recruits, men who thought they could intimidate her, missions where one wrong move meant disaster. She thought of the women who'd come here before, their stories buried under apathy. This wasn't just about her. It was about them. Back off, she said, her voice low but firm. I'm here to hunt, not play games. Mike's grin faded, his eyes narrowing. He stepped closer, his hand grazing her shoulder, his touch lingering too long. Come on, relax, he said, his voice softening but laced with condescension. How about a drink? Got some whiskey in the truck. I could show you how to hunt proper. Yonel shrugged off his hand, her eyes flashing. I'm good, she said, her tone final. Vaylor growled low, his ears flattening, but she signaled him to stay. One more time, step back. The men exchanged a look, their amusement hardening into something darker. Greg's smile vanished, his eyes glinting with malice. You're in the wrong place to be cocky, he said, his voice dropping to a hiss. He leaned in, close enough for her to smell the tobacco on his breath. No one's watching out here. Yonel's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a controlled fury. She'd faced men like this before, men who saw her skin, her gender, and thought they could break her. She thought of her mother, working double shifts to raise her, teaching her to stand tall. She thought of the women whose complaints had been dismissed, their dignity trampled. Her phone was still recording, capturing every word, every threat. She could end this now. Her training gave her a dozen ways to drop them, but she needed more. Evidence. Proof. Mike grabbed her wrist, his grip tight, his voice a low growl. Look at yourself, acting all high and mighty. You don't belong here. Yonel's eyes locked on his, her body still but coiled, ready. She could break his hold in a heartbeat, send him to the ground before he blinked. But she held back, her mind racing. The recording was her weapon, her leverage for the authorities. Vaylor's growl grew louder, his teeth bared, his body poised to act. Let go, she said, her voice a quiet command. Last chance. Greg laughed, but it was forced, his confidence cracking. You're gonna regret this, he said, his hand twitching toward his belt, where a knife gleamed in its sheath. Mike's grip tightened, his grin returning, meaner now, predatory. No one's coming to help you out here, he said. Be smart. Come with us. The crowd nearby had quieted, some hunters glancing over, others pretending not to see. Yonel's chest burned, not with fear but with purpose. She thought of her mother's strength, the women who'd been silenced, the justice she'd sworn to deliver. She could feel Vaylor's tension, his training as sharp as her own, ready to protect her. Her hand rested on her rifle, not to use it, but to signal she wasn't helpless. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice low, dangerous. Walk away. Mike's grip didn't loosen, his eyes gleaming with arrogance. You're all alone out here, he whispered. Be nice, Anne. Yonel's patience snapped, but she held her ground, her training keeping her in control. She twisted her wrist slightly, testing his hold, ready to act. The recording was still running, capturing every word, every threat. She'd come to hunt, but she'd also come to end this, a pattern of harassment that had gone unchecked too long. The crowd's whispers grew louder, but no one stepped in. Yonel stood tall, Vaylor at her side, her resolve unbreakable. Whatever came next, she was ready. Yonel Brooks stood her ground, her boots planted firmly on the gravel, her rifle slung over her shoulder. Mike's grip on her wrist tightened, his fingers digging into her skin, his eyes gleaming with a mix of arrogance and menace. "Be nice," he hissed, his voice low, "and this'll go easier." Greg loomed beside him, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, a smirk twisting his lips. "No one's coming for you out here," he added, his tone heavy with threat. Vela, her German short-haired pointer, growled louder, his teeth bared, his body coiled like a spring. The crowd nearby had gone quiet, their eyes darting between curiosity and discomfort, but no one moved to intervene. Yanel's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a surge of controlled fury. She'd faced men like this before, men who saw her as less, who thought they could intimidate her into submission. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "You're stronger than their hate, Yanel." She thought of the women who'd come to this reserve, their stories of harassment buried under silence. Her phone, still recording in her pocket, captured every word, every threat. She'd come for the hunt, but also for justice, and she wasn't about to let these men win. "Last chance," she said, her voice low, sharp, a command honed by years of training she hadn't yet revealed. "Let go." Mike laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and tightened his grip. "You're all talk," he said, yanking her closer. That was his mistake. In a blur of motion, Yanel twisted her wrist, breaking his hold with a practiced snap. Before he could react, she drove her elbow into his chest, sending him stumbling back with a grunt. Greg lunged, his hand reaching for his knife, but Yanel was faster. She pivoted, her boot slamming into his knee, dropping him to the ground in a heap. Vela barked, a sharp, commanding sound, his presence amplifying her control. The entire takedown took less than 20 seconds, the men sprawled in the dirt, gasping, their bravado shattered. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock spreading through the hunters. Yanel stood tall, her breathing steady, her eyes blazing. Vela growled, his ears pinned back, ready for her next signal. Mike, clutching his chest, scrambled to his knees, his face red with rage. "You'll pay for that," he spat, fumbling for his knife. He pulled it free, the blade glinting as he lunged toward her. Vela moved like lightning, his jaws snapping at Mike's arm. The knife flew from his hand as he yelped, falling back in a panic, his eyes wide with fear. Yanel didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her boot pressing into Greg's chest as he tried to rise, pinning him down. "Stay down," she said, her voice a low growl. From her jacket, she pulled a pair of handcuffs, her movements swift and precise. She snapped them onto Greg's wrists, his protests muffled as he writhed in the dirt. Mike, still on the ground, clutched his arm where Vela's teeth had grazed him, his face pale. "What the hell are you?" he stammered, his voice trembling. Yanel straightened, her rifle still slung, her presence commanding the stunned crowd. She reached into her jacket, pulling out a badge that gleamed with authority. Holding it up, she spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. "Yanel Brooks, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army. Currently serving with Special Forces Training Command. You're under arrest for assault and harassment." The crowd erupted in whispers, their shock palpable. "Lieutenant Colonel," a hunter muttered, his rifle forgotten in his hands. "She took them down in seconds," another said, awe in his voice. Mike and Greg froze, their faces drained of color, their earlier swagger replaced by fear. Yanel's badge was no prop, it was real, official, a symbol of years of service and sacrifice. Vela stood guard, his growl a warning to anyone else who might try her. Yanel's mind flashed to her training, grueling days in the field, nights studying tactics, earning her rank in a world that often doubted her. She'd joined the army at 18, driven by her mother's stories of resilience, determined to prove herself. She'd faced prejudice, hostility, and worse, but she'd never backed down. Now, at this reserve, she wasn't just a hunter. She'd been working with the local police for weeks, gathering evidence on a pattern of harassment against women. The recording in her pocket was the final piece, and these men had walked right into her trap. "You can't do this," Greg shouted, struggling against the cuffs. "We didn't do anything." Yanel's eyes narrowed, her voice cold. "Tell it to the police. They'll be here soon." She'd already sent a discreet signal to her contacts, a protocol she'd set up before arriving. She knew the risks of coming here alone, but she'd prepared for every scenario. Vela's training, her own combat skills, the recording, they were all part of her plan. Mike scrambled to his feet, his hands raised, his voice desperate. "It was just a joke. We didn't mean it." Yanel didn't flinch. "A joke doesn't involve grabbing a woman's wrist," she said, her tone cutting. "Or pulling a knife." She thought of the women who'd come before, their complaints dismissed, their dignity trampled. This wasn't just about her. It was about them, about breaking a cycle of silence. Her mother's words rang again. "You fight for those who can't, Yanel." The crowd watched, some hunters shifting uncomfortably, others nodding in quiet respect. A woman nearby, another hunter, caught Yanel's eye, her expression a mix of gratitude and admiration. Yanel gave her a small nod, a silent promise that this was for her, too. Vela sat at her side, his presence a steady anchor, his loyalty unwavering. Mike's bravado crumbled, his hands trembling. "You set us up," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Yanel's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "You set yourselves up," she said. "I just gave you the rope." She checked her phone, ensuring the recording was secure, then slipped it back into her pocket. The evidence was ironclad, every word, every threat, captured clear as day. She thought of the police reports she'd read, the women who'd been too scared to speak up. This was their victory as much as hers. The hunters nearby whispered, their voices a mix of shock and awe. "She's military," one said, his tone reverent. "Took them out like it was nothing," another added, shaking his head. Yanel ignored them, her focus on the men at her feet. She felt the weight of her mission, the years of training that had brought her here. She'd come to hunt ducks, but she'd also come to hunt justice, and she was just getting started. As she waited for the police, her mind drifted to her mother, who'd raised her alone, working double shifts to keep them afloat. "You're a warrior, Yanel," she'd said, her voice fierce with pride. Yanel had carried that with her through every challenge, every barrier. Now, standing over Mike and Greg, she felt that strength burning bright. Vela nudged her leg, his warmth grounding her, and she gave him a quick pat. "Good boy," she murmured. The fight wasn't over, but this moment, this takedown, was a step toward change. Yanel Brooks stood over Mike and Greg, her boots planted firmly on the gravel, her rifle still slung over her shoulder. Mike, handcuffed and sprawled in the dirt, clutched his arm where Vela's teeth had grazed him, his face pale with shock. Greg, also cuffed, glared up at her, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her bad's authority. Vela sat at her side, his growl low but steady, his black and white coat gleaming in the morning light. The crowd of hunters around them was silent, their eyes wide, their earlier indifference replaced by a mix of awe and unease. Yanel's heart beat steady, her resolve unshaken. She'd just revealed her identity, Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Army, Special Forces Training Command, and the air crackled with the aftermath. She touched her phone in her pocket, the recording still secure, every word of Mike and Greg's threats captured. She'd come to this Georgia hunting reserve not just for the annual duck hunt, but to end a pattern of harassment against women, a mission she'd undertaken with the local police. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "You fight for those who can't, Yanel." This was for them, the women whose complaints had been ignored, whose dignity had been trampled. Yanel pulled a small radio from her jacket, her movements calm and precise. "Brooks to base," she said, her voice steady. Suspects detained. Request immediate backup. The response crackled back, crisp and professional. Copy, Lieutenant Colonel. Units en route. ETA 5 minutes. She slipped the radio back into her pocket, her eyes never leaving Mike and Greg. Mike's face twisted with desperation. This is crazy, he shouted, struggling against the cuffs. We didn't do anything. It was just a joke. Greg nodded frantically, his voice hoarse. Yeah, a misunderstanding. You can't arrest us for talking. Yanel's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Talking, she said, her tone sharp. Grabbing my wrist, pulling a knife, threatening me, that's not talking. That's assault. Valer growled, his ears pinned back, reinforcing her words. The crowd murmured, some hunters shifting uncomfortably, others nodding in quiet agreement. A woman nearby, a fellow hunter with a shotgun slung over her shoulder, caught Yanel's eye, her expression one of gratitude and resolve. 5 minutes later, the wail of sirens cut through the air. 2 police SUVs rolled into the lot, their lights flashing. Officers stepped out, their faces grim as they approached. The crowd parted, their whispers growing louder. She's a colonel, one hunter muttered, his rifle forgotten in his hands. Took them down like nothing, another said, shaking his head in disbelief. Yanel stepped back as the officers took over, hauling Mike and Greg to their feet. Mike's voice rose, panicked. It's a setup. We didn't do anything wrong. You've got no proof. Greg's eyes darted around, searching for support. Yeah, it's her word against ours. You can't prove nothing. The crowd's murmurs grew, some hunters looking skeptical, others curious. Yanel's hand moved to her pocket, pulling out her phone. She held it up, her expression calm but unyielding. Proof, she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. She tapped the screen, and the recording began to play, loud and clear. Mike's voice echoed first, you're in the wrong place to be cocky. No one's watching out here. Then Greg's, look at yourself, acting all high and mighty. You don't belong here. The final blow was Mike's threat, be nice, and this'll go easier. The crowd fell silent, the weight of the words sinking in. Mike's face drained of color, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Greg slumped in the officer's grip, his head bowed, his defiance shattered. The recording ended, and Yanel slipped the phone back into her pocket. That's your proof, she said, her voice steady but laced with steel. Take them away. The officers nodded, their expressions grim as they led Mike and Greg to the SUVs. The crowd erupted in whispers, their shock palpable. She's a lieutenant colonel, a hunter said, his voice tinged with awe. I thought she was just some newbie, another admitted, shaking his head. The woman hunter from earlier stepped forward, her eyes shining. Thank you, she mouthed to Yanel, her hand resting on her rifle. As the police SUVs pulled away, the reserve's manager, a stocky man in a green vest named Carl, approached, his face flushed with embarrassment. He cleared his throat, addressing the crowd. Folks, we owe Ms. Brooks an apology, he said, his voice faltering. We've had complaints about harassment here before, and we didn't act fast enough. That stops today. On behalf of the reserve, I'm sorry, Ms. Brooks. We're grateful for what you've done. Yanel met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. She thought of the women who'd come before, their stories dismissed, their voices silenced. She'd read their reports, seen their pain in the files she'd reviewed with the police. This was their moment as much as hers. I'm not here for trophies, she said, her voice clear and resonant. I'm here to take back respect for every woman who's been looked down on, pushed aside, or threatened in places like this. That's what matters. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound swelling with admiration. Several women hunters stepped forward, their faces lit with pride, some clapping louder than the rest. A young woman, barely 20, approached Janelle, her voice trembling. "I was scared to come back here after last year," she said. "But you're incredible." "Thank you." Janelle gave her a small smile, her hand resting on Vela's head. "You belong here," she said softly. "Don't let anyone tell you different." The young woman nodded, her eyes bright with determination. The other hunters began to disperse, some whispering about Janelle's takedown, others about her military rank. "She's special forces," one man said, shaking his head. "No wonder she handled them like that." Another, an older hunter with a weathered face, saluted her discreetly, his eyes gleaming with respect. Janelle returned the gesture, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. She knelt beside Vela, scratching his ears. "Good boy," she murmured, her voice warm. He'd been with her through every step of this mission, his loyalty as fierce as her own. She thought of her mother, who'd raised her to fight, to stand tall, to never back down. "You're a warrior, Janelle," her mother had said, her voice fierce with pride. That strength had carried her through years of training, through battles seen and unseen, to this moment. As the crowd thinned, Janelle checked her rifle, her focus shifting back to the hunt. She hadn't come just to take down Mike and Greg. She'd come to compete, to honor the skills her mother had taught her in these marshes. But this victory, this moment of justice, felt bigger than any trophy. She thought of the women who'd inspired her mission, their courage in speaking out, their pain in being ignored. She'd done this for them, and for every woman who'd step into this reserve after her. The manager approached again, his voice quieter now. "Ms. Brooks, anything we can do to make this right, you let us know." Janelle nodded, her expression softening. "Make sure it doesn't happen again," she said. "That's enough." She turned, Vela at her side, and headed toward the staging area for the hunt. The crowd's eyes followed her, not with skepticism now, but with respect. She felt the weight of their gazes, but it didn't slow her. She'd carried heavier burdens, through training camps, through missions, through a world that often tried to diminish her. As she walked, she thought of her mother's words one last time, "You fight for those who can't." Today, she had. And she wasn't done yet. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any thoughts or opinions about this story, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our channel to support us. Your support means the world. Thank you again.